is the Black Lives Matter movement headed? Find out what my guests have to say on Talking with Henrietta, coming up next. I'm Henrietta. I'd like to welcome you to this online edition of Talking with Henrietta. We'll be talking about the Black Lives Movement, some of its goals, and how we'll go forward. And I have some very interesting panelists with me, my guests for this show. There's Kyra Brown, there's Vandana Kumar, there's Omowale Satterwhite, Yuriko Kishimoto, Lisa Teeler. And I'd like to start by letting them give a brief introduction of themselves. So, Kyra, why don't we start with you?
All right. Hi, my name is Kyra Brown. I grew up in East Palo Alto, went off to college to Howard University, and came back to give back to my community. And I am just very passionate about giving back to East Palo Alto.
Yuriko?
Yes, my name is Yuriko Kishimoto. I'm really honored to be on a panel with all of you. I'm Mayor of Palo Alto, so I do have I've worked with both all the region, including East Palo Alto and many other cities in this areas. I am the author of a book actually called The Third Century, which talked about America as a world nation. And it's a book that all came true. And I can tell you about that later. We predicted that California and United States was going to become a nation of majority-minority demographics. That was back in 1988. And also I'm on Henrietta's foundation for EPA Media.
Omowale?
Omowale Satterwhite. I've lived and worked in East Palo Alto since the late 60s, early 70s. Been involved in many, many things, probably mostly known for supporting the effort to incorporate East Palo Alto when we became a city in July of 83.
Wonderful.
Vandana?
Hi, everyone. My name is Vandana Kumar, and I came to this country in 1986. And as a new immigrant, I actually started a magazine called India Currents. For 32 years, we printed a magazine, monthly magazine for the Indian American community that lived here in the Bay Area. Today we are 100% digital, and our community has grown, evolved, matured, and we are participating in a lot of civic activity efforts with other media partners. Henrietta is one of them, and she and I have been working together on the Census 2020. So Henrietta, thanks for having me on the show.
Oh, of course. Court?
Hi, I'm Court Skinner. I moved here in 1988 and didn't do anything but drive down to San Jose and work for the semiconductor industry for the first 10 years I was here. And then for some reason, I got enticed to go to a city council meeting in about 1998, and my life has never been the same since. I ended up sitting next to David Chang, not knowing anything about David Chang. I've now become a good friend of his over the years, and of course he's a character that everybody knows. And I've managed to join about, I don't know, a dozen boards of directors. And currently on the Henrietta's board and on the Creative Montessori Learning Center board and the EHP board and Community Legal Services board and the Legal Services for Prisoners with Children, others. And there's still a lot of work to be done in East Palo Alto, and I'm doing my best to learn and help out wherever I can.
Lisa.
Good evening, Henrietta, and all the distinguished members of the panel. It's great to be here. My name is Lisa Teeler. Gender pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm the Executive Director of the Bay Area Community Health Advisory Council, formerly known as the African American Community Health Advisory Committee, that was started by a small group of African American residents in San Mateo County who found information from the Community Health Needs Assessment for the county that African Americans and people of color were at the top of the list for all the various diseases, cancer, cardiovascular disease, you name it. And they were very concerned. And so they formed a group and a partnership with the local hospital, Mills Peninsula, to start offering health education and services to the community. That was back in 1995. I was a volunteer and a sponsor of the group for a number of years, about 12 to 13 years. And then when I tried to retire, I was asked by one of the founders, Gloria Brown, to help the group through a transformational process, and then ended up becoming the executive director. And they do just a variety of different things. Our big event is Soul Stroll for Health. And that's going to be in this October, and it's going to be mostly virtual. So this will be our first time doing that. And I also, when I'm not doing all that, I also do some coaching and training in the area of diversity and inclusion.
Well, thank you, everyone, for all of your introductions and letting everyone see how you're connected in the community. I'd like to start off by asking you how you would assess the protests that are taking place in the U.S. and around the world in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. So this is open. It's an open discussion. Feel free, as someone comments, to make a comment yourself in terms of what they've said or something else that you might like to share. So should I just call on one of you, or who would like to start off? Nothing like all the volunteers.
We're pondering the deep
so
question.
I'll start. I don't mind. I actually have two thoughts. Both of them are contextual in a sense, but when I think about the genesis of this worldwide protest, then I'm reminded of the fact that what goes on in police agencies in this country is very comparable to what we saw happening in the Catholic Church and in the Boy Scouts. So these institutions housed people with maladies and didn't sanction the behavior, protected them when victims stepped up, and allowed them to go from agency to agency without any recourse or review. In that case, the malady was, child molestation. In this case, the malady is white supremacy. And so police officers who are white supremacists go into police departments and get the same comparable privileges that pedophiles got in the Catholic Church. And so that's why all over the country they act with impunity, and why this moment is very important to bring about a change in that institution and that agency in the country. And then a very different but still contextual, I was very active in the late 60s through the 70s and 80s in what was at the time the combined Black Power, Civil Rights, and Pan-African movement. And that was a movement that had breadth and scale, but it paled in comparison to what we see today in terms of the scope and scale of protests all over the country and all over the world, the diversity of that protest, the alignment of the thinking and at least the concern around a common set of interests, and a persistence that has unparalleled in my own experience in thinking about movements in this country and the impact that they've had.
Thanks for sharing, Wally.
Hey, Frank, I wanted to follow up on what he mentioned. And, because you mentioned the civil rights movement. And first of all, I have to acknowledge that I'm here in the United States and on your show, Henrietta, literally, because African Americans organized, led, and died to overturn the racist laws that kept us out. And it is the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which was one of the biggest victories of the civil rights movement. That's the reason that you see people from Asia and people from South Asia in particular who are here today in the Silicon Valley and on your show. So,
well, yes, go on. I was going to say, coming from India, you've had your own civil rights movement in overthrowing the British.
Yes, and I think you all know that that was Gandhi's movement of nonviolent resistance was a model for Martin Luther King Jr., right?
Yes.
And many other Black leaders. We have, we've tried to make see, the thing is, the biggest, you can change people's attitudes, minds, when they're educated about our history. Because when you don't know your history, you're going to repeat it. And we are making an effort to share this history that we have with the Black community in America. And there's just so much that I could speak on that, but let's hear from something else.
I want to jump in because I was also thinking about history, and just very sad that it was in 1863 was the Emancipation Proclamation. And so here we are, it's almost 160 years after. And here we are in our current state as American democracy and society. So when you asked me about this show, I went back and actually looked at the Gettysburg Address, which talked about that, and it really is kind of inspiring. Do you have just a minute for me to read a couple?
Of course.
Yeah. So he says, Abraham Lincoln, 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And he goes on to say that it is up to the living to do the unfinished work, which because he was here, he was there to dedicate the many thousands of people who died, including African American soldiers, they who fought here, and then he goes on to say that we are here highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth.
So are we in this new birth or rebirth of freedom?
Well, we were 160 years ago, and we need to, it's up to us living to continue this, realize the dream.
Lisa, are we in
yes.
birth, and how would you assess the protests?
Well, I saw it as a sort of a perfect storm. We had obviously the pandemic of COVID-19, which was impacting people in their health. And then we have a result of that, the pandemic of economics because of COVID. People were losing their jobs, businesses were closing, et cetera, et cetera. So with these unfortunate, tragic murders that happened, I think that was just one thing that just kind of set everybody over the edge. They weren't as distracted. People were at home. They were, dealing with all their issues and struggles. And here they saw a Black man literally be killed and murdered on TV. And I think that just set people over the edge. We have never really addressed the deep-seated wounds of racism and bias in this country. It was, there were folks during the Civil Rights Movement, and I'm a child of the 60s. My parents marched in the whole 9 yards. But we really haven't really addressed it and actually addressed the systemic racism. Because the individual racism, as Frank was mentioning, the systems have allowed people like he was mentioning into those systems to flourish. And until we address from the systemic racism and discrimination, we will continue to have this problem. And so it is now the Black Lives Matter I see as a wake-up call to say that we need to dismantle, dissect, and review the systems, economic systems, judicial systems, educational systems, and really look at those pillars that they're based on. And a lot of it is based on discrimination and racism. And we haven't dealt with that. So that's why it just keeps, we're talking about, hey, 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 100 years ago, and now we're still dealing with the problem because we didn't deal with the problem.
So Kyra, Lisa just now said, in the midst of COVID-19, everyone was home for the most part, and we saw a Black man being murdered. But this is a sight we've seen before in terms of police killings and videos. So, Kyra, what do you think was so special about George Floyd's murder? And how would you assess the protests going on now?
Let's see. Great questions. I'm not sure what was so unique about this particular instance of Black death on camera. I think that over the years, so I think Black Lives Matter movement as a national movement started about, I want to say like 4 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, 4 or 5 years ago.
That's correct, yes.
And so I can't quite speak to what it was about that moment. It could be what some panelists have already alluded to, the fact that people were at home, right? And maybe on the internet even more than usual, right? Because they're not sitting in traffic, or they're not, in line at the grocery store, or, in line at the bank, or what have you. And so the quarantine, right, forces people to be at home and be on the internet more. We're on a video panel right now as we speak. So I think that has a large role to play. I also, when I think about the protests that are happening, I hear my grandma saying things like, it's the same struggle, but it's just a different day, right? My grandmother was 16 years old when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, right? So that happened in her lifetime. And so for her to see things that are happening and to say, it's not that much different, for me, that is extremely disturbing. And I think the people that are out there protesting are extremely disturbed. And I think that whatever we have done in the past, it no longer is sufficing, right? Or is no longer sufficient. And so people are like, I will get in the street during a pandemic with a mask on my face to show you right? That something has got to change. And so what I think is unique is that people, one, the times haven't really changed very much. We're stuck at home, but people are literally still going outside and saying like, I'm going to protest because this is that disturbing and it means that much to me.
Interesting. Before we get to you, Court, I'd just like to pose an answer to the question I asked Kyra, what was so different about George Floyd's death. But I think the way he died, it was hard to justify. You couldn't really say he was attacking the police. He wasn't cooperating. He pulled a weapon. I mean, here he was lying on his stomach, handcuffed. So I think for those who watched it, it was hard to rationalize what the justification was, at least for maybe millions of people. Now, I'm sure there were some that could rationalize it. Mm-hmm. Court, what do you think? Hello, Court.
I'm here. I'm thinking about how I want to say that. I think it's always hard to rationalize. I don't think this particular instance was any harder than any others. I think the difference, and to some extent, I'm picking up on what Omawale said about persistence. You know, we have gotten all upset about inequity, and we had Occupy, and there was a lot of protests and whatnot that went on, and then it sort of stopped. And of course, we had the same thing in the 60s. And some progress was made, but I don't think we ever got down to the actual fundamentals of the changes that need to be made. I mean, when Lisa's talking about systemic racism, I got a lecture the other day from a new friend of mine about the difference between racism in the 60s and racism today. And here I am, I'm the epitome of the privileged white guy among a bunch of people who are not privileged white guys. And yet, I think the really important thing here is that, it woke up the whole world. I'm not sure I've ever seen that before. I mean, we got George Floyd's picture around the world. It isn't just from Seattle to Florida, it's everywhere. And in addition to that, we have people like the road to resegregation, the color of law. Who's the author from the Atlantic? Whose name I just said, and all sort of bringing up these things in a way that that people are beginning to understand. Now, these are things that most of you all have understood for years, and it isn't so important that you understand them. What's important is that I and all the people who look like me understand them, and I hope that's happening. Because if I look at the cast of characters that's out protesting, it isn't just people that look like you. It's people that look like me and people that look like you. So maybe we're going to make a huge difference this time. And that we got to not stop. So
I talked with someone recently who expressed some concerns that the Black Lives Matter movement would be co-opted, like some other contributions that people of color have made. You mentioned the diversity. Do you think the movement might be co-opted in some way and used to benefit other people who are not?
Of course.
The central.
Of course.
Of course.
I mean,
I'll ask him later.
The thing is, the system we live in was designed, and it's working absolutely perfectly. We all look at it and say, wow, this thing is really a mess and it's not working good at all because it's not working good for me. But people that are benefiting are perfectly happy with the way it's working.
So
And
what do the rest of you think? Do you think the movement might be co-opted in some way?
I think there's always the opportunity for anything to be co-opted. And that's something we just have to be mindful of. But back to Court's point, I do realize, I think is for me as an African American woman who also has a multicultural background, that it was great to see other people that didn't look like me actually fighting for me. And I don't think I've ever experienced that except with family members when you get into, some issue and, your big cousin or your older brother or whatever, sticks up for you in the schoolyard. I've never experienced that. So it was wonderful to actually see. I even though I work and support San Mateo County, I live in Hayward, and we had protests with my Latino brothers and sisters, saying Black Lives Matter and fighting for me. And that was very uplifting and very powerful. So I think that is the difference. Not that there weren't other people supporting African Americans during the Civil Rights Movement, but on a global scale, as was mentioned before, you have people from all different walks of life, from all different countries and nations, with George Floyd's picture and shouting Black Lives Matter in their own languages. I think that's powerful. Now we have to just take that energy and do something else, do something else, other things with that. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Sure, Yuriko.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if it's a question of being co-opted, but I mean, it is true if you look at recent California history, right? There's African Americans, of course, but there's also recently a lot of Asian Americans and a lot of Hispanic Americans. And so I know that, I became the first Asian ever elected to the Palo Alto City Council. And after me, actually, quite a few Asians have been elected to a lot of city councils, and especially in California. And I know that's beginning to happen for Hispanic. But I think the challenge going forward is really, kind of working all together to make sure that, that we don't leave people behind, and it's that the vote is, that we all work together, basically. So I think that's what we need to keep an eye on.
Sure.
Yeah, a couple points, and I actually do want to go back to your last question. When you asked the question, why that event, when I think about it, I think you have to think about it as a part of a broader social context, a broader social history. And someone used the term perfect storm. I think that's correct. In addition to all the wonderful things that people said about the pandemic, about people being at home, about how incredulous it was, about et cetera. You also have a new generation stepping up in a different way. What happens to Black men especially, and sometimes Black women in terms of interfacing with police in this country, that happens to Black people in all European countries. And so they just weren't reacting to what happened here. They were lifting up their own voice around their own oppressive experiences. And then there's so lots of the broader public may not know, but there's always a lot of ongoing activism in the Black community. There's a big conversation about reparations across the world. The Black Lives Movement had chapters in multiple cities and were able to then step up simultaneously and capture the attention of the nation. So you had all kinds of things happening. And in this perfect storm, I think that incident was simply a tipping point.
Yes.
At this point in history. But it did trigger as that tipping point, the thing that happened. And then in terms of your last question about the co-optation, when you go back to the 60s, the Black movement was deemed by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI folks as the most serious issue that was confronting the United States. And so they had a whole army of people spread out all over the country, joined black groups, movements. That
was
effort,
considered communist.
That effort by the FBI was called COINTELPRO, Counterintelligence Program. So people in power who want to extend in perpetuity white supremacy in this country and around the world, of course, they are using their best tools and resources to counteract what is happening in this movement in this time. And they'll make some progress and will make some progress. But I think that the arc of history is toward justice. And so I don't know that it'll be co-opted. It may be slowed down. It may be shifted. It may be mitigated against in the moment in the space. But the arc of history is toward justice.
I think the arc of history probably has always been towards justice, but it's taken us, and it's taking us an awfully long time to get there. And it's like for every movement, there's a counter movement. So do you see this more than a moment? Or do you see, I mean, some of the protests are still going on. And George Floyd's death was on Memorial Day in May. So do you see that? How long do you think this is going to last? And will it just kind of eventually die down?
Henrietta, I think to add to the very passionate points that our previous speakers have done, I'd like to say that we are rather in a unique moment in history. And we have the opportunity to actually shape and build a community where we all belong, in a way that we've never had the luxury to before. This is a time of the pandemic, a global pandemic, where people across the globe are not as busy, not scurrying around, trying to do things, do all the various things. All of us here, even in the United States, we know, just imagine what your lives were before March 13th or 15th. And we were out and about doing our things. We didn't have the time or the mind share to think about or see anything collectively. And I think, in my opinion, that's what's unique about George Floyd and that experience, that we all had the time. If you're on social media, you'll see people are exclaiming about the beautiful sunsets in their areas, or the birds that are chirping. They have the luxury of paying attention. And I think this is also something that happened for George Floyd. People paid attention. And it brought forth to what some of the other folks said. There are racial inequities all across the globe. And it reminded people of their own experiences. Perhaps that's a reason why it went global and not just limited to the United States. You talked about various communities stepping up. I don't know about co-opting. History is going to tell us what happens. But I think this is also that moment where I see that in the South Asian communities as well. And I was trying to remember, when did the Black Lives Matter? And that was after Ferguson in 2014.
Sure. Now, hold the rest of that point, because Kyra is primed for responding. And she's the one millennial, I think. That's among us.
Us baby boomers have to get back. Go on, Kyra. Do your thing, girl.
We can talk about co-opting. Millennials have been in the forefront of saying our culture has been kind of ripped off in co-op.
I would say that I think it's already been stated that any movement has the potential to be co-opted. And I think for me and for, many other millennials, it's about our tolerance. Like, will we allow a movement to be co-opted in the first place, right? So when 9/11 happened, right, God rest all the souls that were tragically impacted by that terrorist attack, right? People set aside a day of honor, right? And they go to that site, right? Ground zero, where the buildings were. And they talk about, right, these twin towers. And the response has never been, when someone asks you to honor those buildings and what they represent and the tragedy that happens, the response has never been, all buildings matter, right? It's like, okay, I'm able to demarcate, right, why that is significant and why that tragedy and that hurt, is there and should be honored and memorialized and remembered and all that, right? But somehow when it comes to Black death in America, at the hands of police, even on a global scale, there is this sort of like, there's this need to divert whatever we are saying is the message of the movement, right? So it's like Black Lives Matter, and then somebody pops up and says, well, all lives matter, right? Or the police have even taken that very slogan, right, that has been drenched in blood, and they've said, you know what, Blue Lives Matter, right? And we're going to make bumper stickers that say Blue Lives Matter with a flag on there and a blue stripe running through to let you know that our counter protest is to lift up our, position as police and say, well, police's lives matter, right? So I think just in the little ways, it's already starting to be co-opted. And I think it's about, for us, it's about like saying, hello, how do you take a movement by and for and about Black people and Black suffering, and how do you divert it and, and slap a slogan on it as if whatever we're fighting for doesn't matter. And I think that's, part of the work as well, is to speak out about that and say Black Lives Matter, point blank, and a period.
So
just really quickly, Henrietta, in this, and just one wrap up sentence. And so people in power, they use money, they use guns, and they use messages to win the minds of the people and control people in the ways that represent their own interests. And I don't call that co-opting. I call that the nature of the beast.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting. When at the height of the civil rights movement, I was reminded that the women's movement started, and then the lesbian, bisexual, transgender movements started. And it's almost like when those movements started, like the women's movement, it took the attention away from, let's say, the civil rights movement of Black people. And when you think of the attention being shifted and evolving into other things, is that possible in this case? For example, Blue Lives Matter, all lives matter, and the attention is then taken away.
Well, sorry, I have a little background noise here, but I want to make a comment on that for both what Henrietta said and Kyra, because, so, for example, in the women's liberation, if only women changed, it's not successful. I mean, men have to change as much as women, and so in that way, I understand the focus is Black lives, and that definitely has to stay a major focus. But the rest of we all have to change, right? Asian Americans and white Americans, So I don't know if you want to say, I don't know if you. I think we do want to encourage everyone else to also look at themselves and say, how do I need to change?
That assumes that people want to change.
Yes.
And there's so many people who are vested in this system. If you consider white privilege is something that actually exists. It's like having affirmative action come in, and people feel that if someone else had an opportunity, then they would lose, that it couldn't be an opportunity for both. So when we're talking about being inclusive, does that mean a loss of power for one group or other?
I think it means the sharing of the power. You can look at the glass half empty or half full. And so people have a choice. It's either I'm going to continue to keep the power and continue to oppress people all over the world, or I can share and come from a place of abundance, and that we can all flourish. And so, like, when that saying that when you rise, all boats float. And so that's a different mindset, because if you've been ingrained for centuries that in order for you to be successful, that means somebody else has to lose, that's going to take a long time to get that out of people's system.
Well, it's taking a long time. You look at it from a slave owner's point of view. What's the benefit for the slave owner in sharing power?
Exactly. That's the question. And in fact, the slave owners benefited even after slavery, because slaves were considered property and you could insure them. So when they lost their slaves, they got paid for that, and our people didn't get anything.
What white supremacists, in this case, the slave owner, may not benefit. I mean, they're the target. But out of that experience, you got, out of that entire experience, the first public schools were established. Everybody benefited. The suffrage for women happened. Everybody benefited. I mean, on and on and on. So she's right, I think. What happens whether it's the Black movement or any other movement, if it can trigger, raise consciousness and trigger action in other groups that are part of those who are on the oppressed side of the equation, then yeah, I think that's a positive benefit. But the slave owner may never win. What the slave owner will try to do is to remain a slave owner.
That's right. And people in power want to keep their power. So, it's interesting, when the protests started, I got lots of emails from companies that said, oh, we agree now with the Black Lives Movement. And one company said, we have to admit that we don't have any people of color on our board. We don't have any people of color high ranking up at the administration. And we've been wrong with that. And I think, my feeling was, well, wait a moment. If you didn't have these people and you think you were wrong, why has it taken this for you to admit that you're wrong?
Because you haven't had to deal with the consequences of it. If you're walking around the world with rose-colored glasses and everything's fine, and literally overnight somebody snatches those rose-colored glasses off of your face, that is, that can be an eye-opening experience. But if you're comfortable and things are well, you got money in the bank, you got your 2.3 kids and your house and car, you're like, hey, I'm cool, And a
lot of people are cool. I mean, they have that. So what's the benefit?
We were not aware, Lisa. You mentioned that, if somebody rips those rose-tinted glasses off, are you saying that they were not aware?
Well,
I were aware. They just were not forced to do anything about it.
Exactly. Well, let me say this. I want to say there's a range, right? There's some folks who, weren't aware. Some people are aware and didn't do anything because they didn't see a need to, because everything was fine with them. So I think there's a range of folks of level of awareness and depth of awareness. Because I've been having some very provocative conversations with people who are, they really truly didn't, they knew there was racism, but they didn't have a sense of what that really meant until they actually saw, or, because of the situation they were in, like we were all home or on TV or whatever, that they actually saw a Black man not do anything and literally get murdered on TV by someone that's supposed to be protecting and serving the community. And, for me, that was hard to realize because that happens every day and we don't really acknowledge it. But in that particular situation, people were, became woke, I guess.
Court.
I was going to say with 3 other cops standing there, he was murdered. Mm-hmm. And so when people talk about like, well, not all cops are bad. What about the good cops? It's like, okay, on this video, you have one person with their knee in someone's neck, and then you have 3 people who are literally standing there watching it happen.
Oh, participating. They were on his back. At least 2 were. And one was keeping the bystanders away.
Although, it seems to me that I remember East Palo Alto has gone through a transformation, right? I remember like 20 years ago, it was the murder capital of America. And then a lot of the cities came to work together. And there's been a new relationship between the police force and the community rebuilt. And in a way, it seems like it's a model. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, you guys we need to advertise that more.
So the community policing model that was set up in East Palo Alto, the police chief at the time actually got appointed by the Obama administration to lead the National Community Policing Program. So it was really quite good. Yes.
And now he's an advisor to Governor Newsom.
Yes.
On David. Oh. So maybe the word will be spreading, huh?
Yeah, that's good. And I also wanted to respond. You were asking if it's a zero-sum game, if if you take power away from one person. But in a way, I'm always an optimist, and so I don't think it has to be that way. And so we framed it when I wrote the book, The Third Century. I said the future of America is. We were created because we didn't want to become another Europe. We wanted to be a world nation where there was a balance of powers, and you could choose your own religion. You could choose, and then, of course, at the beginning there were slaves, but fortunately we changed that. But so actually, in that act of framing America as a world nation, it kind of changed things for me because I transformed from an outsider looking into America, even though I was a U.S. citizen. I was over here just watching. And as soon as I defined America as being a world nation, I was kind of, here I am. I'm a leader of the world, of the world nation America. And and I ran, and that's not why I ran for city council, but I ran for city council, and I got to help shape the future of my community. And part of it is your self-identity and how you perceive yourself and other people perceive you.
So there is a debate now going on within the Asian American community over affirmative action. Because when you look at the UC system, for example, there is a dominance of Asians who are in the colleges, even more so than whites, and then comes Latinos, and then comes Black Americans. So there are Asians who feel if you have affirmative action, that's going to reduce the opportunities for Asians. So that's the thinking of the zero-sum game, where it will be a loss as you become more inclusive. Now, there are other Asian Americans who are arguing that might be the case, but we have to do what's right. And for some of them, it means more inclusivity.
Yeah, I think so. I don't think we want to be in California, which is all Asian.
I'd love to hear what Court has to say about that.
Yes, Court, you had tried some time ago. Court,
I want to get back a little bit to the co-opting issue. There is another category of let's just call it discrimination, and that is between the rich and the poor. And I just recently read a book by a guy named Anand Giridharadas, called Winners Take All, which is a fascinating look at poverty and wealth, and the fact that what do we call when you're giving away a little bit of your money? Not much, just a little. Because you never want to give away enough that you might actually that you might have to become slightly less than a lot more equal. And they have this idea they call win-win. And of course, win-win, the poor people never win. And to some extent, they're also able to take what we were just talking about before, all these differences and concerns and the police, Asians versus whites, and co-opt that into something that causes us to forget that a major problem is we got too many rich people hoarding money that is now not being spent or paid to a whole bunch of people that essentially are not too much better off than the slaves were in the 1700s. I mean, if you really look at the overall situation in the country, people that can't afford houses, people that can't afford, just to live an ordinary life, and we can. There's a bunch of reasons that there's more black people than white people that do that, but there's also a bunch of reasons that there shouldn't really be anybody who couldn't do that. And if we fix it for one, we could probably fix it for all.
So what we've experienced is that there are more and more people falling into the poverty category, with the food lines being filled with even those who might have been middle-class people, where 91% of the wealth or more is held by 1% of the people. So the wealthy are getting even wealthier. And in some cases, that's been blamed on the advance of people of color. But I don't think recently that there's been that finger pointing.
I'm reading a book now by Thomas Piketty, the economist.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote Capital in the 21st Century, and then he has a book called Capital and Ideology, which is all about understanding the history of societies of inequality. And I recommend it. So it's obviously it's not new, but what you say is true. It's not just race issues. I mean, in a way, the structure of our economy is becoming just, the only middle class left in the Bay Area is really almost like public sector union members, or there's not many people left in the middle. So there's from the nature of work to lots of other and tax laws. There's a lot of things you can do, including tax policy, etc. But
well, I'm going to respectfully disagree and say that there is inherent racism and discrimination in every system that has been formulated in this country, including the economics system, because as African Americans, we were not allowed to build wealth, to own homes, get loans, start businesses. So although, the poverty issue is definitely a pillar of that, there is still an element of racism and discrimination in all systems that are built in this country. And we need to just acknowledge that. Because otherwise we will continue to be having this conversation and there will continue to be protests.
Well, I just think we're going to be where we are if we expect to dismantle all of the systems that we consider racist. How do you dismantle systemic racism in every sector of society? And it seems to me that's what full equality might require. So how are we going to get to that stage?
I'm not sure, but we're going to have to do something. And maybe we start with one. Maybe we start with education or the judicial system, because there's forms of slavery within that in terms of the the prison industrial complex. You've got people of color in jail for, minor crimes or can't pay their $75 to $100 bail. And then you have people who are worth millions of dollars living in it. They go to jail for 5 months and then they're out.
Well, it's interesting. Some of them don't even go to jail,
Exactly.
Well,
some of them are not even in the judicial system.
How Cohen, for example, Trump's lawyer, went to jail, but then he said COVID-19. And, the actress whose children were in UCLA or University of Southern California.
Bought them a spot.
Yes, and they're home now because of COVID-19. And look at all the prisoners now who have caught COVID-19 are in hospital.
Yeah, that's a mess.
Oh, Kira.
I wanted to add something. This is always a fascinating question for me because maybe dismantling systems is in some way incremental, right? I don't know how to fully explain it, but I'll give you an example. People have said and continue to say, how are we going to give Black people reparations? How's that even going to work? How are we going to figure out the logistics? How are we going to trace back who was actually enslaved and, who wasn't? And this conversation has been happening for longer than I've even been alive, right? Mm-hmm. But what was it? In a matter of 3 weeks, folks got COVID checks. Like, folks got stimulus checks because of COVID. And so to me, it's like, if we want to figure out the logistics, we will do it.
Yep.
And I don't know, I'm not trying to oversimplify it because it's complicated in some ways. In the way, when I have these conversations with my grandma, she's like, they figured out the logistics for slavery and now they want me to figure out the logistics for reparations for them. She's like, give me a break.
Now, wait a moment. You talk about people figure it out. Who will figure it out?
So let me speak to that.
The people in power will figure it out. The decision makers will figure it out. But
maybe the millennials will.
Yeah,
what's our input? Okay.
I think she's right when she uses the idea or construct of incremental. On my wall, and earlier people said, the challenge or the task is to raise people's awareness, consciousness, and then create the wherewithal for people to make a difference where they are. I mean, a couple of people have said that tonight. I just want to add one other dimension to that idea. On my wall, I have something that reads as follows. We all die. The goal is not to live forever, but rather to create something that does. And so it's beyond just raising consciousness and getting people involved. It's asking, it's empowering people, inspiring people to have a great big vision and to know that they can change the earth. And then in the course of engaging in their little ways, going back to what Cairo said, we'll figure out the logistics of connecting it and making a difference. But it's going to be incremental. I think she's absolutely right about that. And when you ask a question that big, and it's a great question, it's too complex for us to come to find some common ground around. But we can all agree that all of us can step up, and we ought to be understand the relationship between the different oppressions, as people have talked about here, and how to connect those voices and to move forward in an incremental way, understanding that what we talked about earlier, the slave owner is always going to use money, going to use messages, and going to use guns or militarism, the 3 M's, to try to control the day.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Mm-hmm. But Yuriko, your book in terms of America, that's where we are now. So how does your book leave us? What does it say about where we are and where we need to go?
Well, the book is, it's about, it was written in 1988 when it's about more US versus Asia, actually. But we said that U.S. is going to have rough times in the short run, but that we are structured to be the most resilient and robust society to ride out the waves over the centuries. And that is because we are one of the more successful open economies and open societies, that we're not dependent on any one race. It's not anyone, it's not just the whites, it's not just the Asians. Our structure, our democracy, our system to elect people is supposed to be colorblind, and we elect the best people, get the best ideas out, and that's how eventually we're going to get out of this, that we're successful.
It would be great to think that we elect the best people, but we obviously
don't do that. Mm-hmm.
So I'm thinking some would say, and I can certainly appreciate the powerful message that Frank Omawali just now gave us, and Yuriko's optimism. But some would say we're looking at, in terms of the rise and fall, that what was the great America that Trump wants to make great again might be showing its decline. And so I'm wondering what you all think. Is this part of the decline, or is this part of the resurrection?
Well, I'd like to say something. I think when we withdraw as leaders from the world stage, whether it's from the climate agreement that was made among nations, mm-hmm. or the United Nations, or when you withdraw your leadership, it's not going to leave. It's not going to stay in vacuum. Something else will come and take its place. Yeah. So America is abdicating.
China
position. We can be focused on domestic matters, but we've always had that moral authority, and perhaps it came with our fiscal ability to help across the globe. We had that moral authority, and I think that's definitely changing. We are definitely very connected with countries across. I'm connected with India and read a lot about international relations. And I can see that if America doesn't want to, and, you can make America great again, but the rest of the world is going to keep moving on. And they're not waiting for us to become great again so that we can lead, And the problem, the other thing that I've noticed, government, to Kyra's point, government can be a solution because it's an elected government. All of us as citizens have a voice. Mm-hmm. It's unfortunate that we all choose not to vote. It's such a powerful tool we have. Oh. And it's a shame that 100,000 people did not vote in the last election. Eligible people who were eligible to vote did not vote. That's a powerful number. And what happens? You have a message that goes around that, we're expecting government to do all of these things, but you cannot defang, defund, and delegitimize government and then expect it to do something. And this is something I heard from Anand Giridharadas at his talk to court. And I thought that, wow, that's actually pretty powerful. It's so true.
So are you saying we can't defund the police and then expect them?
No, I said government.
Yes.
Yes. Police is not government. Our elected officials are government. And they have the police also reports to somebody. Maybe I don't know what the structure is in any place, but usually those people are elected officials.
That's right. Yeah, the police department is accountable to the city council.
Yeah, so and those people are, they are accountable to the people that elect them. There are city council meetings that we as citizens have the opportunity to go up and to show up and speak. And the city council people will be forced to do something if they want to remain elected or to run for election again. We do have an option. And I think we can, to returning to the Black Lives Matter and what police, the movement around to defund the police. Why do you think all of these actions are happening so quickly? At least there is conversations about policing in schools and universities and adding more social services organizations to handle mental health issues. Why is all of this happening so quickly? It's happening because all of us who are, people are protesting. People are showing up at city halls. People are showing up on a regular basis. And the people who make these decisions are feeling the heat.
Yep. That's right. I mean, Court and I ran for city council, so I think the rest of you can.
About government. Government makes rules. And when we stop government from making rules and enforcing rules, things go to pot. If you have enough money, you see, you can convince government to stop making rules that govern your behavior. And of course, that's what's happening. As you get a few people with a bunch of money, they can create situations where the rules don't apply to them for all kinds of, we watch it happen every day. And we say, wait a minute, that can't be right. First of all, that's not America. That's not government. And of course, we have a lot of these people say, well, we want the government to be the same size as can fit in the bathtub and nonsense like that. And ultimately, we have to put government back in place, doing the job that it needs to be doing.
That's interesting. Yuriko, you were going to say that you and Court were running for city council.
No, I guess I was just saying that Court and I stepped up and we ran for city council. And now it's everyone's turn. Kira and
I actually was on a city council too, the first city council in East Palo Alto.
There you go.
And I go to a lot of city council meetings. People are tired of hearing from me because I'm constantly in people's faces all the time.
But I think it's a point well taken that playing an active role in lifting up your voice at the local government level or whatever level is your interest is a critical way to shape the future of the country.
So, yes. And I also find that we need to be in the room. Okay?
Because in the room where it happened?
You have to be in the room where it happened. I want to be in the room where it happened. Because I can't tell you how many meetings I went to, city council meetings, other government meetings, and serious decisions, particularly policy decisions, are being made, and people of color are not in the room. So we need to be in the room, even if we are not prepared to speak or whatever. You can ask questions, you can follow up, you can do a lot of things. So it doesn't take a lot of effort. However, I will say that is another system that we have to deal with and manage and burden. So there's both sides of that. But if we want to change something, we're definitely gonna have to be involved. There's no question about that.
Well, I hear several things in terms of how we move forward, that it's going to be government and it's going to be citizen participation, which means we have to be an educated citizenry to know where our interest lies, right? Mm-hmm. So what would be some of the other steps forward? Or whatever might be important that we haven't discussed or that should be stressed?
Wow. It's going to take all of us to make this happen, make it possible. So it's not just Black folks or women or LGBT. It's going to be all of us marching forward to a common goal of being inclusive, and that we see the benefit. If the grandmother down the street gets her insulin medication, that means that's tax dollars not coming out of my pocket when she shows up as an emergency and has to have her leg amputated. So, we're all connected. We're all part of an ecosystem. And whenever there's a part of the ecosystem that's not functioning properly, we all suffer. And that's really the bottom line. And and that's the mindset that we're going to have to do in terms of moving this forward. And this whole thing about Black Lives Matter, yes, it's mattered because for centuries it didn't. And you see the result of what's happened as a result of that. So it's going to take all of us to make sure that we'll have a better world we want to live in.
So would all of you agree that Black Lives Matter encompasses all people in this country, even though it's Black Lives Matter?
Of course.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely, yes.
And Henrietta, I also want to say that this cannot be just a moment. This cannot be just a moment in history. It has to be a movement that can be sustained, that needs to be sustained. And I feel that this moment is different from all the other moments that I've experienced here. Maybe Kyra's grandma is going to say differently, but I think we are all vested, and we have to stay vested, because change happens in itty-bitty steps, but they can happen faster when everybody is in it together.
Interesting. Final last words, Kyra?
I was going to add one thing. I think that at America's core, right, it was built upon anti-Black racism. So
and
that means
Native American. Yes. And perhaps anti-Chinese with the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Yes. My point is that in America, non-Black people often benefit within this system in some way, right? And so I think if we're talking about Black Lives Matter, if you get a sociology textbook, you can look at a pyramid and it says, this is the social hierarchy in America. What has never been debatable is that Black is always at the bottom. And so when we are talking about Black Lives Matter, I'm down for having any people of color ride with me, right? Ride with us in our struggle for liberation. But what that means is non-Black people still have to check their own anti-Black racism and the ways that they benefit from being a non-Black person in America. So if folks are able to do that, that level of internal work, you can march with me any day of the week. You can come to any city council meeting that I'm at, because you know that you are not immune to all of what's going on, right? And I think we have to not romanticize allyship, right? Mm-hmm. And what inclusion actually looks like, because it's not just, let me talk about what this white person is doing who's the top of the social pyramid. It's like, let's go all the way down and let's talk about how we all contribute to said anti-Blackness, right? And how we can dismantle that together, but we can start internally first before moving out externally.
I totally agree.
I would just add one other point. Thank you so much for that thought. As a practical matter, everybody who's oppressed in some form, they will tend to lead with their own identity issue. And so while you're being guided by the really thoughtful comments that were just made, then as Black people, we also have to build coalitions and relationships that allow us to move the work forward. And so we have to be respectful of other identity issues, and it never frame it as an either or, yours versus mine. It's like, right, we need for you to embrace our issue, and we also need to be in a position to embrace yours.
Fascinating. Anything else to add?
And historically, we've done that. We have, been there for all the other movements, the women's movement, LGBTQ plus movement,
environmental justice, all of them.
We're always, at least the way I was raised, if somebody was hurting, we were there. we're just asking, show us some love too. That's all we're saying.
So are we now at that time with this movement where others are showing some love too?
I would say yes.
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 Yes. That is great. Thank you.
I guess that might be a good point to end, unless there are any other comments.
No, I love the panel. Thank you all for such a stimulating conversation.
Well, I'd like to thank you all.
You're here.
Yes, Cord and Lisa and Vandana and Yuriko and Kyra and Franco Mawali Satterwhite. Thank you all very much for an intriguing discussion in letting us get some insight in how we can look at the Black Lives Movement and see what steps we need to take to reach the goals that we've talked about. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity.
Everybody.
Joining us.
Wonderful to meet everyone.
Yes. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye. Have a nice evening.
Good night.
Everyone do the same. Goodbye. Well, that's the end of the show. You've heard a lot of interesting ideas. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time.